Marco sat alone on the boat, staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean stretching to the horizon. The silence here was different, almost oppressive, as if the sea itself was guarding a secret. His phone vibrated in his pocket for the third time that morning, but he ignored the calls. He needed a moment to absorb what he was about to do. In his mind, the last words of his friend echoed, filled with urgency, "You need to find Leo." He disappeared into the abyss. And even after the call ended, Marco felt the weight of the situation tightening in his chest. Leo was more than just his brother. He was the only one who understood his passion for the ocean. They had grown up by the coast, always diving, exploring, discovering. But the abyss that stretched below them now was different, a place neither Marco nor Leo had ever dared to explore. The abyss had always been shrouded in mystery, one of the deepest and most unexplored regions of the ocean. To Marco, there was something about that place that seemed to call to him. And he couldn't ignore the call. As he adjusted his diving equipment, his eyes fell on a small amulet hanging around his neck. It was a gift from Leo, something he had given Marco years ago as a symbol of protection. Marco had never believed much in such things, but at that moment, he gripped the amulet tighter, as if somehow it could keep the looming danger at bay. Taking a deep breath, he prepared for the dive. The sky was overcast, and the sea looked darker than usual, as if anticipating Marco's presence. He plunged into the water, and the impact was like an electric shock coursing through his body. The noise of the world above was replaced by the deep and unsettling silence of the depths. He had dived in many places before, but this felt different. As he descended, the pressure increased, and the sunlight gradually faded until it was completely swallowed by the darkness. The sense of isolation was overwhelming. Marco knew he was alone, yet he felt something was there, watching him. The first thing he found was a piece of Leo's gear, slowly drifting in the water like a dead leaf. It was a part of his diving vest, stained with a small patch of what looked like blood. A shiver ran down Marco's spine. He held the vest tightly, as if he could absorb some trace of Leo. But all he felt was the cold, deep and empty, seeping into his bones. This was only the beginning, he knew. There was more. And he had to keep going. Following the trail of debris, Marco ventured deeper into the abyss, feeling the weight of the water pressing in, pulling him down. With every meter he descended, the silence grew more oppressive until he began to hear something. At first, he thought it was just the pressure, a faint hum in his ears. But as he went further, the sounds started to transform into something more familiar, almost like words. Marco tried to push the sensation aside, but the feeling that someone was speaking to him was too strong to ignore. Suddenly, a voice echoed in his ears. It was a whisper, faint and almost imperceptible, but it was there, unmistakable. He looked around, trying to find the source, but all he saw was darkness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to regain focus. This was impossible, he told himself. He was alone, or at least he should be. But the voices continued, growing louder, more insistent. Some sounded like laughter, others, muffled cries. He couldn't make out any specific words, but the sound itself was enough to put his mind on edge. Marco tried to ignore it, focusing on his breathing. He knew he had to stay calm, that panic would only lead to mistakes. But it was hard not to be affected by the persistent sound that seemed to come from all directions. With every meter he descended, the voices seemed closer, clearer. He felt as if he were being sucked into something much larger than he could comprehend, something ancient and deeply unsettling. The darkness around him began to shift, and he realized he was approaching an area where the rock opened into a cave. The entrance was massive, dark, and seemed to pulse faintly, as if it were alive. Marco hesitated but knew this was his only chance to find Leo. Bracing himself, he approached the opening and felt a cold current pass through him, sending chills through every fiber of his body. He was in uncharted territory, and the sense of danger was palpable. But he had to keep going. Inside the cave, the pressure increased even more, and the voices grew louder. Now, he could clearly hear one of them, calling his name. It was impossible not to recognize that voice, even after so many years. He froze, listening intently, and the voice repeated, like a distorted echo at the back of his mind. He blinked, confused. This couldn't be happening. The voice belonged to his father, someone who had been dead for a long time. He couldn't believe it, but the voice was there, resonating in his head, pulling him deeper into the abyss. Marco hovered in the water, motionless, trying to understand what he had just heard. His father's voice echoed, soft and muffled, like it was whispering directly into his mind. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting against the memories that surged, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was indeed trying to communicate with him. The sound repeated, and now he sensed something more, a pattern, a rhythm, like an old and familiar melody. Moving slowly, Marco continued his descent, guided by a strange impulse he couldn't quite explain. The beam from his flashlight barely pierced the thick darkness, and the depth seemed to open around him like a giant mouth, ready to swallow him whole. He tried to rationalize the voices, but something in the back of his mind told him that what he was hearing couldn't be explained with logic or science. He felt like he was being watched, as if thousands of unseen eyes followed his every move as he pressed on. As he ventured further, he found a small object floating, stuck between two rocks. As he got closer, he realized it was a camera, with a cracked display but with the recording lights still flickering. He carefully picked it up, recognizing it immediately as Leo's camera. The sense of urgency surged within him. Something inside told him he needed to see what was on it, to understand what his brother had captured with the device. As he examined the camera, the sound of the voices receded, giving him a brief moment of calm. He took the opportunity to turn on the display, which emitted a weak glow. The images were blurry and grainy, but he could see Leo, his face tense and focused. The recording showed his brother looking around, apparently speaking to someone. Marco turned up the volume, trying to catch the words, but the audio quality was poor. Still, through the static, he managed to hear a chilling phrase, "They're here." "Can you hear them?" Marco's heart raced. He didn't know who Leo was referring to, but the certainty that something else was there with them was enough to make him grip the camera tighter. It was as if, somehow, his brother was trying to warn him about what was happening in that place. The voices, now more distant, seemed to whisper something in response, forming a strange cacophony that echoed through the walls of the cave. Marco looked around, searching for any sign of movement. He knew he wasn't alone, but he couldn't see anything beyond the oppressive darkness. He moved forward a few more meters, following a primal instinct that pushed him onward, but he felt like each step was taking him deeper into a nightmare. Around him, the rocks seemed to form faces, distorted, like ghosts trapped in the abyss's depths. He tried to push these thoughts away, but the image of the faces haunted him. It was as if the very environment was alive, watching him, testing his resolve. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a new sound, something that resembled laughter but was distorted, like it came from a creature that had never laughed before. Marco shuddered, remembering a childhood incident when he and Leo got caught in a storm far out at sea. That night, they heard the wind howling, and Leo swore it was the laughter of sea spirits. Now, so many years later, that memory seemed more real than ever. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling that the voices were mocking him was undeniable. Fear was starting to morph into panic, and he knew he had to stay in control. He began repeating to himself that it was all in his mind, that the isolation and pressure of the depths were playing tricks on him. But, at the same time, he couldn't deny the feeling that the voices were revealing something he didn't want to face. Marco took a deep breath, trying to focus. He decided to follow Leo's recordings, believing they might lead him to the truth. As he moved on, he found a waterlogged journal, half buried in the sand. The leather was worn, but he could read the first few pages, which were strangely intact. It belonged to Leo, and the words scrawled there revealed a disturbed mind, someone teetering on the edge of a breakdown dot. "The voices are real," one page said. "They know all my fears, all my secrets. I don't know if I can trust myself anymore." Marco felt a chill. The idea that his brother had been battling something he couldn't understand was terrifying. The next few pages revealed more about what Leo had found. There were strange drawings, symbols Marco had never seen before, and descriptions of creatures that seemed ripped from a nightmare. "They hide in the shadows," read one of the last phrases. "They've been here for a long time, waiting." Marco didn't know if he should keep going, but curiosity pushed him forward. He needed to know what had happened to Leo, needed to understand what these voices wanted. Finally, he realized he was approaching the heart of the cave. The rock around him seemed to pulse, almost as if it were a living organism. And that's when he heard it, clear and distinct, a familiar voice calling his name. It was Leo. Marco looked around but saw nothing. The voice echoed, seeming to come from all directions at once. He tried to follow it, but the darkness seemed to close in around him, like a trap preventing him from finding the way out. Feeling his anxiety grow, Marco pressed on, not knowing if he was heading in the right direction or if he was only getting more lost. But Leo's voice called, growing more intense, more desperate. He knew he had to keep going, that there was no other option. He was trapped in that abyss, but he wouldn't give up on finding his brother. Even if it meant facing the voices that hunted him. Even if it meant going deeper still. Marco could feel that with every meter he descended, he was sinking deeper into absolute darkness. The cave around him seemed to widen, as if he were entering the mouth of a sleeping creature. The light from his headlamp cast faint beams, only emphasizing how small he was compared to the vast, unknown space surrounding him. The sense of isolation was intense, but he fought off any thoughts that could distract him from his focus. He had a purpose, to find Leo. Nothing else mattered. Suddenly, something moved ahead of him. Marco stopped swimming, frozen. At first, he thought it was just the light reflecting off the cave walls, but then the movement repeated itself, this time closer. He squinted, trying to see more clearly, but the darkness was thick and opaque, as if it absorbed any trace of light. Then, a shadow darted past him, just a few meters away, quick and silent, like a predator sizing up its prey before attacking. Marco took a deep breath, trying to control the panic spreading in his chest. The sound of his own breathing echoed in his helmet, reverberating in his ears like a drumbeat. He was alone, and that was a fact he tried to remind himself of every second. But the presence of that shadow challenged everything he believed. He knew the abyss held secrets, but he hadn't expected them to feel so tangible, so close. He had to keep moving, to figure out what that shadow was or, at least, to escape it. As he swam slowly, keeping the light fixed on what lay ahead, he felt something brush against his arm, and a wave of cold surged through his body. It was as if he had touched something non-physical, an invisible presence that dissolved the instant after. Marco shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. His mind told him it was impossible, but his instincts warned him that he wasn't alone. Not here. Not now. With effort, he pressed forward and came across what looked like an abandoned artifact, a small metal cylinder partially buried in the sand. Picking it up, he realized it was an old marker used by explorers to map unknown areas. There were inscriptions he couldn't decipher, but they seemed to belong to a forgotten language, maybe even alien. He tucked the object into his pocket, thinking it could be a clue to what Leo had found. As he lifted his gaze, what he saw ahead made him freeze again. At the edge of his flashlight's beam, something was moving slowly. This time, it wasn't just a shadow. It was a humanoid figure, with strange proportions, elongated limbs, and a silhouette that seemed to undulate as if it were blended with the surrounding darkness. Marco felt a cold knot form in his stomach, and for a moment, he thought about retreating. But there was something familiar about that figure. Hesitantly, he moved closer until the light fully illuminated the creature, revealing a face he knew. It was Leo. Or at least, a distorted version of him. His face was pale, almost translucent, his eyes wide but empty, and his body appeared deformed, as if stuck in a transition between the human world and something far older, far darker. Marco felt bile rise in his throat. That couldn't be his brother. But before he could react, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come," said the creature, its voice a mix of Leo's with something deeper and more distorted, as if many voices were speaking in unison. "They're here. They're waiting for you, too." Marco took a step back, his heart racing wildly. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing, but nothing made sense. The voices. The shadows. Now Leo was standing there, right in front of him, but he wasn't really Leo. Or was he? Marco tried to speak, but his mouth was dry, unable to form words. The creature stepped forward, extending a pale hand. "You heard them, Marco," the creature said, now with more clarity. "Just like I did. But they're part of us now. And you can't escape." The pressure around him seemed to increase as Leo, whatever was left of him, came closer. Marco took another step back, nearly slipping on the sandy cave floor. He felt the air becoming thinner, as though the presence of that figure was draining his energy. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to grab his brother and pull him back to the surface, but another part knew that this, whatever it was, wasn't Leo anymore. Suddenly, a wave of voices flooded his mind, a chaotic mixture of whispers and screams that made him clutch his head, trying to block out the sound. But it was impossible. The voices surrounded him, filling his mind with confused words and overwhelming emotions. Panic surged within him, and for a moment, he thought he was going to lose consciousness. But then, amidst the chaos, a single word surfaced, clear as water. "Run." It was Leo's voice. The real one. For a second, Marco saw his brother's face, a look of desperate pleading in his eyes. Then the figure dissipated, vanishing into the darkness as if it had never been there. Marco stood there, breathless, not knowing what had just happened. His body trembled, and he could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The voices subsided, and silence once again filled the cave. He knew it wasn't over. That creature, or entity, was still there somewhere, waiting. But he also knew he had to keep going. Leo was alive, somehow. And Marco wasn't going to leave him behind. Marco stayed still for a moment, panting, trying to process what he had just seen. The image of Leo, or whatever that thing was that took his form, dissipating in front of his eyes left him shaken. But as terrifying as it was, Leo's true voice calling out, pleading for him to run, was a clear sign that his brother was still there, somewhere. The hope, mixed with fear, pushed him forward. He adjusted the oxygen tank on his back and quickly checked the depth gauge. He was deeper than he had ever gone before, and the pressure of the water around him made every movement a conscious effort. Still, he swam on through the submerged cave, with his flashlight sweeping the path ahead, revealing nothing but darkness, broken by the occasional rock formation. The feeling of being watched never left him. Marco dove deeper into the cave, and soon his flashlight caught something different. A faint glow, almost imperceptible at first, pulsed on the horizon. At first, he thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, exhausted from the tension. But as he got closer, the light seemed to grow, still faint but visible enough to draw him in. The cave widened before him, and soon the narrow tunnel he had been navigating opened into a vast chamber. At the center of that space was a structure that seemed alive, a rock formation emitting a soft, bluish glow that pulsed like the beat of a giant heart. The feeling of cold intensified as Marco approached, and the voices, which had subsided, now returned, louder and more insistent. He felt a growing pressure in his temples, as if something were trying to invade his mind. As he got closer, Marco realized it wasn't just a rock. It was something much older, a built structure, with symbols carved into its surface. It looked like some kind of portal, a passage to another place or time. He didn't know how, but he could feel that this thing was connected to everything that was happening. The voices, the shadows, Leo's disappearance, everything led to this. The water around the portal was strangely calm, as if that place existed in a different reality from the caves surrounding it. He ran his hand over the carved symbols, trying to make sense of them, but they didn't follow any logic or language he recognized. However, as his fingers touched the surface, a sound made him instinctively pull back. It was that distorted laughter again, echoing through the cave like a sound that came from all directions at once. The voices were louder now, and though the words were still indistinguishable, they seemed to form a cadence, an ancient and sinister melody. Suddenly, Marco heard his name, clear and distinct amid the noise. Marco. This time, the voice wasn't Leo's. It was another, a woman's voice, soft, almost seductive. He froze, gripping his flashlight tightly. The pulsing light from the portal seemed to grow stronger, as if it were reacting to his presence. Marco took a step back, but the voice continued, rhythmic and hypnotizing, drawing him closer. He felt a tug inside his mind, an irresistible pull to approach the structure. With each step, the light grew brighter, and the pressure around his head intensified. His memories began to blur with images he didn't recognize. Dark figures passed before his closed eyes, and he could feel something trying to penetrate his mental defenses. It was as if the cave itself was testing his resistance. Marco knew he was on the verge of discovering something terrifying. The sense that he was approaching a boundary between reality and another dimension grew stronger. For a moment, he questioned whether any of it was real, if what he was seeing and feeling wasn't just a manifestation of the pressure or the abyss itself. But the pain in his head and the cold enveloping him were too real to ignore. As he stared at the portal, a figure began to emerge from the light. At first, it was just a shadow, indistinct, but as it moved, its silhouette became clearer. It was a woman, ethereal in appearance, with hollow eyes and a serene expression. Marco watched, paralyzed, as she floated toward him, moving in sync with the pulsing light. There was something about her that seemed deeply wrong, as if she were out of sync with the world around her. The woman stopped in front of Marco, and for a moment, he felt an inexplicable calm, a sensation that the weight of the depths had lifted. But soon, that calm was replaced by a growing sense of dread. The figure opened her mouth, but said nothing. Instead, she pointed toward the portal, as if offering him a choice, a path to follow. Marco hesitated. He knew that crossing that barrier could mean never returning. But at the same time, there was something irresistible about the invitation, as if all the answers he sought lay beyond that point. Suddenly, he was interrupted by another sound. The distorted laughter returned, this time closer, more intense. Marco looked around, searching for the source, but saw nothing except the darkness surrounding the light of the portal. He knew he was being watched, that something was waiting for him there. And for the first time, he felt that time was running out. The voices began to blend again, now in a crescendo that echoed from all sides like a dissonant symphony. Marco pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. He needed to get out of there. He needed to find a way to escape before it was too late. With one last glance at the portal, Marco turned and began to swim back the way he had come, his heart racing and fear gripping his mind. He knew that whatever was in that cave wasn't going to let him go so easily. But he also knew he had no choice. The answers he sought were hidden deep in the abyss, and he was only just beginning to uncover them. Marco swam faster now. The weight of his discovery, the feeling of oppression from the portal, and the voices that echoed in his mind all added pressure to every movement. The terror that something was chasing him, watching, ready to strike, pushed him to keep going. Even though his muscles were exhausted, he forced himself to move forward. The beam from his flashlight was the only thing connecting him to reality, cutting through the thick darkness surrounding him. What he had seen at the portal made no sense, but he knew it was dangerous. Something alive was in that cave, something that toyed with his sanity, trying to lure him further into the abyss. And now, more than ever, he felt like he was losing control of his own mind. The memories surfacing weren't just his own, as if something were planting images and sensations inside him, confusing him with each new thought. With every meter he ascended, the environment around him subtly changed. The cave walls seemed less stable, with tiny particles of sand drifting through the water. It was as if the very space around him was distorted. Marco knew this wasn't natural, that the place he was in was more than just a cave. The connection to the portal made everything clearer. He was in a place where the laws of physics no longer applied, where time and space seemed to warp. Suddenly, he heard a sound ahead of him, interrupting his thoughts. At first, he thought it was another echo, but he soon realized it was something more tangible. A low, deep moan, like someone struggling to breathe. Marco's heart raced. He knew that sound. Without thinking, he swam faster, with the flashlight shaking in his hands. His instincts told him he was close, but his mind screamed for caution. Something was wrong. The beam of his flashlight finally caught a figure ahead. On the sandy floor of the cave, partially covered by rocks, was Leo. His body looked fragile, curled up, and he was gasping for air, as if each breath was a painful effort. Marco froze, unable to process what he was seeing. Was it real? He blinked several times, fearing it was another illusion. But no. His brother was there. And this time, it didn't seem like a trick of his mind. It was Leo. Marco, Leo whispered, his voice weak, almost inaudible against the pressure of the environment. Marco rushed over to him, kneeling beside him. Leo's face was pale, the veins beneath his skin appearing darker, as though something was spreading through his body. He looked up at Marco with exhausted, but lucid, eyes. I tried to get out, but they wouldn't let me, Leo said, coughing afterward. Marco held his brother's shoulders, feeling the fragility in his bones. Whatever had happened to him had drained almost all of his energy. Leo's very presence there, alive, seemed like a miracle, but the words he was saying filled Marco with dread. They? Who are they? Marco asked, his voice firm but filled with a contained anguish. Leo shook his head, as if fighting against his own mind was as exhausting as fighting against the cave's pressure. The voices, they're not just echoes. They're them, they're ancient. They're trapped here, and they feed on our pain, our fear, Leo whispered, his eyes lost somewhere in the darkness beyond Marco. They made me see things I never wanted to remember. Marco felt a deep chill crawl up his spine. Leo's words confirmed everything he had feared since he started hearing the voices. The abyss wasn't just a crack in the ocean. It was a prison for something much older and more powerful, something that fed on human vulnerability, hiding in the shadows and turning fears into reality. And now, more than ever, Marco knew they had to get out of there before it was too late. I'm going to get you out of here, Leo. We're getting out, Marco said with determination, lifting his brother with difficulty. But as they tried to move forward, a new wave of distorted laughter echoed through the cave, causing Marco to stop abruptly. The voices were closer now, stronger than ever, and they seemed to surround them, like predators closing in on their prey. Marco looked around, feeling the space around them tightening. The shadows danced on the walls, and he knew they didn't have much time. Leo looked at his brother with an expression of despair. "Marco, it's no use," he whispered, his voice barely forming. "They won't let us leave. We're trapped with them." Marco's mind raced, searching for a solution, an escape. But no matter how hard he tried to think, the growing panic and the pressure from the voices in his head clouded his clarity. Whatever those entities were, they were playing with their minds, trying to confuse them, to make them vulnerable. But Marco wasn't ready to give in. He knew he couldn't trust the voices, that they wanted to manipulate them, to make them give in to despair. He needed to keep control over himself and the situation. Supporting Leo, who staggered beside him, Marco pressed on, refusing to stop. "We'll find a way out," Marco repeated to himself like a mantra. No matter how much the voices tried to destabilize him, he needed to keep moving forward. But with each step, the darkness became more oppressive and the whispers grew louder, as if the entities were surrounding them, closing in from all sides. When Marco and Leo reached a fork in the cave, the voices grew so loud that it was almost impossible to distinguish what was real. Marco's head throbbed, and he saw Leo close his eyes, struggling to stay conscious. The air around them seemed to vibrate, and a new figure emerged from the darkness. This time, it wasn't just a vague shadow or a distorted image. It was something much more real, and Marco knew that the choice he made next could be their last. The figure standing before them seemed to be waiting. Marco stared at it, his gaze fixed, unsure of what to do next, but knowing that something was about to happen. Time seemed to stretch, and he could feel the weight of the decisions he would have to make. Marco's body felt heavier with every passing second as he tried to support Leo's weight on his shoulders. The voices around him were growing deafening, and the figure emerging from the darkness ahead seemed to be feeding off the chaos unfolding in their minds. Marco's breath was labored, and the pressure in his head intensified with every second, as though the presence of this entity was draining his strength, pushing him closer to collapse. The figure floated in the dark, outlined by a faint, ethereal glow. Its eyes, if they were eyes, reflected a ghostly light, and its body seemed to twist slightly, as though in constant mutation. Marco clenched his fists, trying to stay focused, but he knew that what he was facing wasn't something he could defeat physically. This was an ancient entity, something hiding in the depths, feeding on fear and despair. He could feel that truth in every fiber of his being. Leo, barely conscious by his side, muttered incoherently. His brother was on the verge of passing out, and Marco knew he needed to act fast, or they would both be consumed by the voices and the darkness. He looked at the figure ahead, trying to decipher if there was any clear intention behind its presence, but all he felt was an overwhelming presence, a void that sucked out all hope. "You will never leave," the voice of the entity echoed through the cave, distorted and deep, as if it came from all directions at once. Marco felt the force of the words, as though the cave itself was folding in on them. The entity moved closer, slowly, each motion accompanied by the sound of displaced water and whispers reverberating in Marco's mind. The instinct to flee screamed inside him, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Maybe it was the desperate hope that there was still a way out, or maybe it was Leo's voice, now weaker than ever, pleading for help. Marco knew that if he didn't confront this thing, he would never be able to save his brother. And worse, he would never make it out alive. "Why are you doing this to us?" Marco asked, his voice hoarse and desperate, the words coming out with effort. He didn't expect a response, but, surprisingly, the entity stopped. For a brief moment, the voices ceased, and silence filled the cave. The floating figure tilted its head slightly, as if pondering his question. "Your sustenance," the entity said, its voice a whisper of 1,000 souls, reverberating in Marco's mind. "Fear, pain, that is what we feed on. You come in, and you never leave. You are part of us, now." Marco felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a threat. It was an immutable truth, a sentence. He looked at Leo, who was on the verge of passing out, and he knew there was no more time. If they didn't do something now, they would be consumed by that thing. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, but at the same time, Marco felt a small spark of resistance ignite within him. He wasn't going to let that happen. Not while he could still fight. With one last effort, Marco knelt down and grabbed the emergency knife strapped to his leg. He knew that a physical attack would likely be useless against something as ethereal as this entity, but he had to try. Holding the blade in his hand, he looked directly at the creature, which floated silently in front of him. The voices returned, growing louder, but Marco blocked them out as best as he could. He stepped forward, feeling the weight of the water and the darkness trying to hold him in place. The entity didn't retreat. It seemed curious, as though watching the final moments of a human ready to give up. But Marco wasn't about to give up. He moved closer and, with all his strength, swung the knife toward the creature. The instant the blade cut through the space where the figure floated, a sharp, distorted scream echoed through the cave. The air around him trembled, and the water around Marco began to vibrate violently. He was thrown backward, the knife slipping from his hand. The impact caused him to release Leo, who collapsed beside him, barely conscious. Marco tried to regain his composure, but the pain in his body immobilized him. When he lifted his eyes, he saw the entity writhing grotesquely, its limbs distorted, and the light surrounding it flickered intensely. The voices grew louder, a maddening crescendo as though every soul trapped in that place was screaming at once. Marco felt his mind on the verge of collapse, but he knew he couldn't stop now. He needed to find a way out, any way out. The entity was weakened, but not defeated, and time was running out. With trembling hands, Marco crawled over to Leo, pulling his brother closer. He looked around desperately, searching for an escape route. The cave seemed to be collapsing, the shadows around them growing and shifting, as if they were preparing to engulf them both. Breathing heavily, Marco held onto Leo and began to move. The entity still twisted in the distance, but he knew it would come back stronger if he didn't act quickly. They had to get out, and they had to do it now. Even with his body aching and his mind exhausted, Marco forced himself to keep going. He advanced through the cave, feeling the weight of the abyss on his shoulders but never stopping. The entity screamed in the distance, but Marco didn't look back. He knew that their only chance of survival was to keep moving forward. And for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to escape. Now, it was just a matter of what waited for them on the surface, if they could make it there. Marco swam as fast as he could, Leo held tightly by his side. His brother's body was almost limp, dragging him down, but Marco refused to give up. Every stroke was a battle against the terror and growing dread. He could feel the entity reconstituting itself behind them, and the shadows on the cave walls seemed to stretch like invisible tentacles, trying to pull them back. The path to the surface felt endless. The darkness around them remained oppressive, and even though the voices had faded, they still haunted Marco's mind. He knew they weren't free yet. Something was still following them, something that wouldn't let them go so easily. Every time he glanced back, the shadows seemed to writhe, as if the cave itself were alive, trying to trap them. Leo was weak, barely able to keep his eyes open. Marco knew their time was running out, not just for him, but for his brother too. Leo's words echoed in his head, about the voices and the suffering they caused. This place, this abyss, was a trap. Something down here fed off them, off their fear, off their weaknesses. And now, with every meter they ascended, Marco felt as though they were being pulled back. But he wasn't going to surrender. Not after coming this far. Marco glanced at the oxygen gauge on his equipment, watching the numbers climb slowly. They were getting closer to the surface, but the way up was long, and he knew they didn't have much air left. Every movement required more effort than the last, as if the water around them was getting thicker, more resistant. It was as if the abyss itself was fighting against them, trying to keep them trapped. Suddenly, Leo muttered something. Marco stopped for a moment, looking at his brother, trying to understand what he was saying. Leo's words were weak, barely forming, but Marco could make out one phrase: "They won't let us leave." Marco's heart sank. He knew Leo was right. Ever since they had entered that cave, there had been an invisible force holding them there, something that didn't want them to escape. Marco looked around, searching for any sign of an exit, any path that could lead them away from this place. But all he saw was darkness. Endless, suffocating darkness. Slowly, the water around them began to vibrate again. It was subtle at first, but soon the vibrations intensified, becoming a growing wave of pressure that pushed him downward. Marco fought to ascend, but the sensation of being dragged back was unmistakable. The voices, which had quieted, now returned with full force, whispering in his mind, telling him to give up, telling him he would never escape. For a moment, Marco almost gave in. The exhaustion, the pain in his muscles, the constant fear, everything was pushing him to the edge, as if all he had to do was let go of his brother and allow himself to sink. But then, he looked at Leo's face, pale and drained, and something inside him reignited. He couldn't give up. Not here. Not now. With a muffled scream, Marco forced his body to keep moving, fighting against the growing pressure that tried to pull them back. Each stroke was a struggle against extreme exhaustion, but he didn't stop. The beam from his flashlight still flickered, and he kept it pointed upward, like a beacon guiding him away from the abyss. With every stroke, he felt like he was moving further away from the entity, but he also knew it was still there, watching, waiting for a moment of weakness. The shadows around them seemed to thrash, moving faster now, as if they were furious at seeing them escape. Marco could hear the whispers, growing louder, trying to confuse him, trying to convince him there was no way out. But he refused to listen. No matter what those voices said, he knew there was a way out. There had to be. The depth gauge continued to rise slowly, but with every meter, Marco felt time slipping away. The remaining oxygen wouldn't be enough if he didn't find an escape route soon. He knew he needed to conserve energy, but the panic and the need to save Leo kept him in constant motion. They were close, but the abyss seemed to stretch endlessly, as though the cave itself was expanding, trying to keep them trapped. Suddenly, his flashlight caught something ahead. Marco blinked, trying to focus, and saw the outline of a rock formation that was different, something that looked like a crack in the cave wall. An exit? Hope surged through him, and Marco swam with every ounce of strength he had left, pulling Leo with him. The crack looked small, but it was the only chance he saw to escape this underwater prison. As they approached, Marco felt a new wave of pressure. It was as if the abyss were trying to seal the crack, to block their escape. The shadows were moving frantically now, and the voices screamed in his mind, louder than ever. But he didn't stop. With a final, desperate effort, Marco pushed Leo through the crack and squeezed himself through right after, feeling the rough rock scraping against his gear and skin as he passed. On the other side, everything was calmer. The pressure lifted, and the voices suddenly fell silent. Marco turned to look back at where they had come from, but all he saw was darkness. The shadows that had pursued them seemed to have vanished. He gasped for air, trying to catch his breath, but a strange feeling settled over him. It wasn't relief. Something was still wrong. Even outside the cave, the abyss seemed to cling to them, as if the very water was tainted by the presence of the entity. Marco looked at Leo, who now seemed a bit more alert, but still weak. They were close to the surface, but Marco knew the true danger hadn't passed yet. They weren't safe, not yet. Marco and Leo floated in silence, trying to catch their breath after the almost unbearable effort of squeezing through the narrow crack. Marco knew they were closer to the surface, but the calm around them was unsettling. The absence of voices, the sudden, deep silence felt more threatening than the chaos they had left behind. It was as though the abyss itself was waiting, hiding in the darkness, watching them with unseen eyes but present all the same. He looked over at Leo, who was starting to regain consciousness but still looked drained and disoriented. His brother blinked, his eyes hazy, as if he was still under the influence of the shadows that had haunted him for so long. Marco felt a tight knot form in his chest. Something felt off. Even after escaping the depths of the cave, a part of Leo seemed lost, as if something had been ripped from him. But he was alive, and that was all that mattered right now. Marco quickly checked his oxygen gauge. They were reaching the limit, and there was no room for more mistakes. They had to keep ascending, fast. He gripped Leo's arm tightly and began swimming again, slower this time, trying to conserve the little energy he had left. The crack they had passed through was fading behind them, swallowed by the absolute darkness. But the feeling of freedom didn't come. Marco had expected to feel the weight of the terror lift as they rose, but the unease didn't leave him. With every meter they ascended, it felt like a new wave of silent anxiety washed over him, as though something invisible was rising with them. He couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss was somehow following them. Suddenly, Leo stopped. Marco felt the tug on his arm and turned around quickly. His brother was floating, his eyes wide, staring down into the darkness below them. Marco tried to get his attention, but Leo didn't respond. He was transfixed, looking downward, motionless, as if he were seeing something that Marco couldn't perceive. "Leo! We have to keep going," Marco said, trying to shake him back to reality. But Leo slowly shook his head, his gaze never leaving the void. "They're down there, they're still watching us," he murmured, his voice weak and almost unrecognizable. Marco felt a shiver run down his spine. He looked into the abyss, but all he saw was darkness. No shadow moved, no entity seemed to follow. But Leo's expression was enough to make the fear return full force. Marco gripped his brother more tightly, forcing him to move. "Don't look down." "We're almost there," Marco insisted, trying to maintain calm. But deep down, he knew Leo wasn't wrong. The feeling of being watched, of being followed by something beyond comprehension, hadn't disappeared. It was like the abyss was climbing with them, lurking, waiting for the right moment to pull them back. With every meter they rose, the light around them grew slightly brighter. They were getting closer to the surface, which should have brought relief. But instead, the tension only grew. Marco felt as if time was stretching out, every second turning into a monumental effort to reach the light that seemed so far away. And then, something changed. The water around them started to vibrate, barely noticeable at first, but soon the ripples grew stronger. Marco looked around in alarm, feeling the familiar tingle of imminent danger. The shadows that had been chasing them were back, but this time they weren't just flickers. They were emerging from the darkness below, twisting and forming distorted figures that seemed to rebuild themselves from the very abyss. Marco forced every muscle in his body to keep moving, pulling Leo with more force. The shadows were closing in quickly, and he knew they didn't have much time. Panic rose within him, and the only thing that kept him moving was the thought that the surface light was close enough to save them. But the shadows were fast. He could feel them closing around their bodies, as if the very ocean were trying to trap them, dragging them back into the eternal darkness. "Marco," Leo's voice was even weaker now, barely a whisper. Marco looked at his brother and saw his eyes beginning to close again. He was slipping into unconsciousness once more, which meant their time was almost up. The oxygen was running low, and exhaustion was overtaking their bodies. Marco knew that if he stopped now, they would never leave this place. With a final burst of strength, Marco swam with all his might. The surface shimmered above, so close that he could almost feel the air, but the shadows were even closer, closer than ever before. He could hear the voices again, whispering his name, calling him back. It was as if the abyss was alive, trying to drag him back into its depths. Marco clenched his teeth, ignoring the pain consuming his body. He wasn't going to stop. The light of the surface was finally within reach. Marco pulled Leo up with him, fighting against the shadows that still tried to grab them. And then, with one last desperate effort, he broke through the surface of the water, gasping for air as if it was the first breath of his life. The sound of the voices vanished instantly, replaced by the sound of the wind and the waves lapping against the boat floating nearby. Marco held onto Leo tightly, keeping his brother's head above water as he panted heavily. The surface felt so calm compared to the chaos they had left behind. But even now, as he struggled to get to the boat, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that the abyss was still watching him. Something he couldn't see, but knew was there, hidden in the depths, waiting for another opportunity. He reached the boat with difficulty, lifting Leo first and then hauling himself up with the last of his strength. Lying on the deck, with his heart pounding and his body exhausted, Marco looked up at the sky. The world above seemed normal, but he knew that what they had experienced was anything but. Leo lay beside him, breathing heavily but alive. They had escaped, or so it seemed. For a moment, Marco closed his eyes, trying to block out the memories of what they had faced down there. But the voices, though distant, still echoed in his mind. Something had let them go. But deep down, he knew, the abyss hadn't fully released them. The silence was only temporary.